This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/FastGadgets. Welcome back, Gadgeteers. So this is my first video with my Logitech 4K Pro webcam, so forgive me if there's some problems with choppiness or anything like that. Now, I did do some pretty significant testing before I actually decided to shoot a video, so hopefully everything will be okay. But let's go ahead and get it started. As you already know, the topic for this video is Linus Torvalds and his subsequent temporary or possibly permanent departure from the kernel development team, and what it means for that entire kernel development section of Linux, and what we as users can expect. Will there be any changes? What's going to happen to Linux? What's the future look like? Well, we're going to get into all that right now. So if you haven't really been paying attention, Linus Torvalds is not necessarily the most empathic character around. He definitely has his own way of dealing with stress and dealing with process when it comes to developing the Linux kernel in his own special way, and it is actually somewhat acidic, so to speak, a little abrasive. He can be when he's working with others. So in some ways he's a perfectionist in his own right. He likes to make sure things come out the way he thinks they should come out and try to put out the best code possible. And to some extent, given his position, he's under quite a bit of pressure while working on the kernel and working with the team that he works with. However, he has come to realize that his attitude towards other people is becoming an impediment, so he's decided that it would be best for him to step down as, if not the official leader of Linux kernel development, more so the de facto leader, and take a break. And he mentions in one of his emails that, you know, I do need to take breaks from time to time, and he went on to discuss how he before has taken a break, and one of the things he did was do some development for some other software. So he's saying that on an official standpoint, I'm taking this break because I need to go off and develop some other software. But in his posting and his email, he does basically lay it out that that's not the only reason. Now, behind the scenes, my thinking is that something a little bit more detailed and elaborate has happened. But having the experience as a director with a technical department and working with others, I really think something else happened behind the scenes. I don't think it was sexual assault or anything like that, but I do think that there was some issues with how he's treating people, and it got bad enough that it was brought to the attention of other people that are high up in kernel development, and they came forward and had a discussion with him about it. This is my thoughts, okay? So I can't say this has happened. And so he's agreed to step down. Why do I think that? Well, the reaction of the rest of the kernel team was to develop a new code of conduct and code of conflict for the kernel development team. Whenever you see a new code of conduct come out, you know, for the most part, unless it's more trivial changes, it is addressing a flaw or problem in the system. Think of it this way. The Titanic in 1912 goes out, sails, hits an iceberg, sinks, kills hundreds of people, major loss of life. And what is the reaction of the different countries? Well, for one thing, they revamped communications. So now you had to have a communications officer on hand listening to incoming communications all 3 shifts, first, second, and third, in case another ship did communicate a distress signal. Second, you had to have enough lifeboats for the number of people that are on the ship. This was not a requirement back then. Believe it or not, it actually went by dry weight, I believe it was, or some other crazy number that they came up with that didn't have to do with the number of bodies that are actually on the ship, if you can believe it. But the point being, there were changes made. While the same thing's happening here, something went wrong. It's more than what we hear on the surface, but at the same time, I think we've heard enough, and we'll get into that in just a minute, because Torvalds said, I'm going to take a walk for a bit and cool down, and I don't know when I'm going to be back. And the rest of the dev team said, we need to come up with a new code of conduct. The new code of conduct, as it is written, I don't really have a problem with it. The problem I do have with these codes of conduct is they can be abused. They can be misused. Now, there's other development teams working on other open source software that have abused these code of conduct documents and made it work for political agendas. One example is Mozilla, and we've talked about that before. So far, 2 of my favorite projects, the Linux kernel development and Fedora, have kind of skirted this political battle that seems to have gripped the United States and taken it over. Now, I'm an instructor in college, and if you do a search for Evergreen University as an example, or the West Coast or the East Coast, where the political structure is much more liberal, you will see some absolutely insane stuff, especially with Evergreen University. You've got to take a look at it. I teach in the Midwest, so I'm in Michigan, and for the most part, the political leanings, the political structure, and I'm really happy about this, and I hope it stays this way, is still very quiet. And we are in Michigan, not me personally, but in Michigan, more liberal, slightly left of that centrist meter. And for the most part, though, culturally speaking and politically speaking, there is still respect and at least some empathy for the other side of the aisle or the other side of the political spectrum, no matter where you happen to land. Lucky for me, I'm more of a centrist. I would say, if anything, I would be more towards libertarian. So I can sympathize and see the points on both sides, although I'm sure you understand, I don't agree with, nor do I ascribe to the extreme left point of view and the extreme right point of view, the so-called alt-right and alt-left. So to me, that is not taking into account the needs and the common good of everybody. Well, without having to get into politics too far, some of these open source development projects have, in the larger ones, unfortunately, have become infiltrated with what you'll hear on the news quite a bit and on YouTube, SJWs. Now, are they social justice warriors? Yes, to some extent, but more so their political structure is liberal. And we see this a lot in technology companies like Google, for example. Google is an extremely liberal company, and if you don't know that, I'm sorry to break your heart, but that's the way it is. So their tolerance for ideas outside of their political sphere is very low, very, very low indeed, and I think you've seen some of that yourself. If you do searches for politics, SJWs, things like that on Google or YouTube, you'll begin to see what I'm talking about. And it kind of galls Google that there is such a base of right-leaning and alt-right political pundits that are on YouTube, and it annoys them to no end. But that's the way it is. Well, that kind of structure infiltrated the open source movement, and it is problematic. The thing is, as much as those on the right hate to admit it, the whole SJW movement now kind of really gone way too far. I don't know how else to describe it and be polite. It's gone way too far, but initially the whole SJW movement was a legitimate response to a legitimate political, well, not a political issue, one of equal rights and equal opportunities within an organization, in this case, our open source communities. Initially, it made sense, but now the pendulum has swung way too far the other way in some of these organizations. And so, as an example, if you are not of the same political leaning, you will be ostracized, kicked out, removed. And using these codes of conduct that are developed, they use them to basically remove you. I see that as a problem. I'm not going to go into all the details and give you examples. Really, you should do your own research and make your own judgments on that. This is something that I personally feel, and with the research that I've done. Now, I have one video about Mozilla. Maybe you want to take a look at that one. Do a little research on Google. They are not open source, of course, but they do have the biggest open source operating system, which is Android. And what they are doing with Android is actually very fascinating, how they're working hard to stamp the open source foundation of Android with their proprietary applications. Remember how you used to have just an internet application to get on the web? It was a browser, and they did away with that and replaced it with Chrome. And I know you're going to say Chrome's much better, blah blah blah. Well, of course it's much better. It's closed source. You know what I'm saying? I know it's free, but they do collect information about you. But the point being, how do they make money off that? It's really simple. If you're manufacturing phones and you say, hey, I want to put Android on there, and they say, would you like to use the Android store? If you would, then you're going to include our apps. If we find out you don't, we will block access to the Android store. So you're going to install this flavor of Android exactly as we say, with our proprietary non-open source closed source applications. So anyway, Google does deal in open source to some degree. Now, what all brought this to a head and why we're hearing about it now is because Linus Torvalds was supposed to attend the Maintainers Summit. Now, the Maintainers Summit is about 40 or 50 of the key top people that come together and discuss the Linux development, where it's going, where it's headed. Fairly important, but at any rate, Linus Torvalds accidentally scheduled his vacation at the same time as the Maintainers Summit. Here's what Torvalds said. He said, you know, I'm going to go on vacation. I don't need to be there. So herein is the first problem. We're talking about whether or not Linux can get along without Linus Torvalds. Well, this is from his post. This is Linus Torvalds himself. I was mostly hopeful that I wouldn't have to go to the Kernel Summit that I have gone to every year for just about the last 2 decades. Yes, we got it rescheduled, and no, my maybe you can just do it without me there got overruled. Let's think about that for a minute. So he has to be at the Maintainers Summit according to the other members. However, he's going to step down after that and take some time off. I guess what I'm trying to say here is Linux can live without Linus Torvalds, and someday it's going to have to. I mean, it's inevitable. One way or the other, he will no longer be a part of Linux. It's going to come to that point. Yet, the rest of the maintainers did not feel comfortable running the summit without him. And I think this was a perfect opportunity to let them get used to running the summit on their own, at least the summit, and not have Linus there guiding them. The fact is, at some point, somebody else is going to have to stand up and say, hey, we can control the reins here. We're able to be the leadership for at least the kernel dev project and the other projects, because there's a bunch of people involved in the Maintainers Summit, and move forward. And we don't necessarily need Linus Torvalds here. But let's go on. But that whole situation, Torvalds says, then started a whole different kind of discussion, a kind of, incidentally to that one, the second part was that I realized that I had completely misread some of the people involved. Now here's a very telling paragraph. This is Torvalds again. This is my reality. I am not an emotionally empathetic kind of person, and that probably doesn't come as a big surprise to anybody, least of all me. The fact that I then misread people and didn't realize for years how badly I've judged a situation and contributed to an unprofessional environment is not good. Now this part is why I'm saying that something happened with a very influential group of kernel developers that was basically brought to Linus's attention. They confronted him. This week, people in our community confronted me about my lifetime of not understanding emotions. My flippant attacks and emails have been both unprofessional and uncalled for, especially at times when I made it personal. In my quest for a better patch, this made sense to me. I now know this was not okay, and I am truly sorry. He got to the point where he has to apologize. And the reality is, we don't know everything that happened behind the scenes, but I suspect what he calls a lifetime of not understanding emotions, in reality, in this case, why this was brought to his attention is really abuse of some sort. And it goes against the current code of conduct and this new code of conduct for sure. He goes on to say, the above is basically a long-winded way to get to the somewhat painful personal admission that, hey, I need to change some of my behavior and I want to apologize to the people that my personal behavior hurt and possibly drove away from kernel development entirely. We don't know, at least recently, who he is purported to have hurt, but the fact is it's happened, and it may not have been in writing, so it may not have been emails he sent or postings on any forum. It may have been direct face-to-face, and the fact is he's done something that is more significant, so more than likely in agreement with, his committee or whoever he's working with and whoever he abused, all have agreed that he should step down at least for a period of time. One thing I do think will be good for the Linux kernel development team is that they will get a chance to work without Torvalds. And I think this is very important because sometimes you have leaders right there within not the company, the organization that can flourish when they know it's only them they can rely on to fill that vacuum, and so they do. And this is a great opportunity to try that out. The other factor is it may last longer than they think. For all we know, criminal charges could come out. We don't really know the extent of what's happened here. So this may be a longer term absence, if you will, and could be forever. We really don't know. So taking a look at the new code of conduct, there's really nothing that I see that's problematic. Like I said before, the ultra left and the ultra right have learned how to take advantage of basic documents like this and use it to their own political agenda, especially when they get a majority within an organization, and that's part of the problem. Let's take a look at this document. What's the pledge? Well, we're going to foster an open and welcoming environment. We pledge to make participation in our project and our community a harassment-free experience. So no harassing or abusive behavior against others. And we're basically saying here, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, and so on, gender identity, expression, level of experience, education, socioeconomic status, race, religion, blah, blah, blah. There's one thing that's missing. Do you see it? What do you think? No political beliefs. I know that you're going to say that's trivial, but it's not. It is not trivial, and it really should have been in there, but it's not in there. So if a political structure of an organization leans one way or the other, then that's an element that could be used against somebody. Examples of behavior that contributes to creating a positive environment: using welcoming and inclusive language, being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences, gracefully accepting constructive criticism, focusing on what is best for the community, showing empathy towards other community members. I could go on, but when I look at these types of documents, and I've had discussions with my students about this at length, there have been huge companies that have caused death from immoral and unethical practices that have had documents just like these that are signed by all the employees, including the CEO and all the higher managerial staff in the company, yet the company will actually cause issues that end up killing people. The problem with this type of document, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have codes of conduct or anything like that, but we're asking people to agree to these codes of conduct and act ethically and morally. Now, the problem here is that you can teach ethical behavior. We're doing that right here. We are showing an individual who might be interested in working with this development team what ethical behavior is. So this is ethical behavior. And incidentally, note this one here, showing empathy towards other community members. Why do you suppose that one's put in there? Given that particular point, those that have empathy often are deeply hurt by those who don't have empathy, and those with empathy cannot understand why that is so. They don't understand why somebody would be so hurtful. But my thinking is that that person that has no empathy usually is sociopathic and could have conditions like Asperger's or other conditions that might tend to make them, if not blunted or ignorant or not able to understand or feel that empathy, or on the worst end of the spectrum, the sociopathic side, they really don't care to feel it. And they understand that they don't feel it and they don't want to. So that's how they run their life. They're kind of what they call the type A personality. We're damn the torpedoes, move it forward. We're going to do this no matter what. We're going to win. The human aspect is not important. What's important is the ultimate goal, which is the best kernel. And he says as much, Torvalds, in his posting. Again, back to ethics and morality. Well, the problem here is that you can teach ethical behavior, but you cannot force somebody to be ethical. Even if you can make somebody adhere to one of these documents and appear to be ethical, you cannot teach morality. Having this document doesn't really mean that it's going to protect the organization from problems that can happen, like these ones. Sexualized language, unwelcome sexual attention or advances, trolling, insulting, derogatory comments, political attacks. Interesting that they do mention political attacks here, but up here in the pledge, political identity is not protected. If somebody isn't moral, they can pretend to be ethical, even if they have sociopathic behavior. And that behavior, that non-empathic behavior, can be hidden for a while, but as they feel out the organization, it can begin to come out, especially when somebody gets to the highest position in an organization, like Linus Torvalds did. So he felt, I'm too important to lose, even if he didn't think it. I'm saying felt it, not think it. Even though he didn't think it, he felt that he was too important to lose, and his behavior was something that he just probably emotionally thought that people would have to put up with subconsciously, because if they don't, he would leave, and that would make it that much more difficult to develop a Linux kernel. Whether or not it is more difficult is irrelevant, because eventually he will leave. And when he does, whether the kernel dev team creates the worst kernel imaginable or the best one since he's left, the fact is he'll be gone, and it won't really matter. You see my point? Think of Apple. So Steve Jobs, the second coming of Jobs, right? He basically got the company on the right tack, and then he passed. He died. The current CEO of Apple took over, Tim Cook. Now, for the first time, Apple is a $1 trillion company. $1 trillion company. That is amazing. They are so flush with cash, they actually went ahead and, in order to avoid the lawsuit in Ireland, went ahead and paid $16 B as in Baker, $billion in arrears in back taxes, instead of fighting Ireland in court and possibly having to pay more in taxes. But Steve Jobs is gone. He was the great leader of Apple. You know, most people thought Apple was going to crash and burn. Now, I grant they're kind of on coast right now. They're just producing iPhones and making them supposedly bigger and better and faster and so on. As one of my viewers pointed out, who are you to question the iPhones? You're still on a classic version. That's true. I am. I have a classic iPhone. I mean, essentially, it's an iPhone SE, but it works perfectly. I don't buy a new one every year or every 2 years. I'm kind of getting off the point here. So, if Linus Torvalds leaves, what will happen to the company? I keep calling it a company. If Linus Torvalds leaves, what will happen to the kernel dev team? My thinking is it may get a little worse. It may get a little better, but the kernel will keep coming, and Linux will keep chugging, and things will keep moving on. More pressing is the politicization of the organizations that are overseeing this open source development. That is where the big concern is. Linus sounds like isn't overly political. The problem is he's got an attitude. So he may leave, and we may get somebody that's very ultra liberal that replaces him and is left leaning, and then the organization will take a very big and deep political change that will affect the kernel dev team and may cause other developers to leave. If the Linux kernel dev team was a company, basically by Torvalds making this announcement, what we would have seen is a drop in stock, and a drop in stock prices indicates that the market is unsure of Linux and a little bit nervous about its future. How can we measure what companies are thinking about Linux with Torvalds taking a walk for a little while? Well, what I would expect to see is companies developing a more cautious stance on their Linux development plans. Some companies are dependent on Linux. An example is Ubuntu. They've got that entire back end that they've developed in Linux and cloud services that they're working on now. So Linux is it for them. They have no other software they can go to. A company with a huge market cap might say, let's start developing our own kernel in-house and we could open source it, or we could fork the Linux kernel and see if we can get developers to swing our way. Maybe like Red Hat or Fedora projects say, hey, we're going to fork the kernel and start developing our own open source kernel. If things get kind of scary inside the current kernel dev team, that would be something I would expect to see if the market kind of feels that ripple effect. The comment by Torvalds is a rock getting thrown into the lake. Now starts the ripple effect. We'll see how long it takes. If the political structure of the dev team changes too much and it gets really weird and people start leaving because they are uncomfortable and it's not working out for them, and we lose more developers, not just Torvalds, we may see a fork by another organization and we may have two kernels, right? Because that new organization, Red Hat or whoever, doesn't want the kernel to be an unknown quantity. They want to be assured that the kernel that they are receiving is exactly what they need and it's on time. That would be the key. So is this the end of Linux? No, far from it. Yes, it is, again, the ripple in the lake, so there may be some changes that are coming in the future. Should you be worried if you're a personal user of Linux? Heck no, I'm not worried. Any more so than I am having a private company like Microsoft basically be in charge of every single thing that I do with my operating system, or Apple. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. Don't mind my puppy. Right, Pix? Come here. Come here. Don't mind Pixie. She's just getting a little mouthy, right, Pix? How do you feel about Linux, buddy? She loves Linux. Pixie loves Linux. If Pixie loves Linux, you can love Linux too, even without Linus Torvalds. Right, Pix? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video and you like supplying Pixie with the best dog food that money can buy and some treats, consider subscribing, sharing, and possibly becoming a member on Patreon. I know Pixie would love it, and so would Meadow down on the floor. I would pick Meadow up, but she's huge, and I can't hold her in my lap. Thank you, as always, for watching. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets.